with. So today is a good foundational video to start understanding how authors use techniques to develop characters in short stories. Let's get going, everybody. So let's start with a quick question. Think about a character from a short story that's stayed with you, or any story at all that you've read. Stayed with you not because of what happened, but because who the character was. Maybe they were quiet, maybe frustrating, maybe the character was surprising in some ways. Now ask yourself this: how did you actually get to know that character in the story? Um, the reason I ask this question is because most authors won't pause and say this person is brave, lonely, and afraid of change. If they did, the story would feel flat. Instead, writers show who characters are gradually. They rely on readers to notice. The process is called characterization, and understanding it makes you a much stronger reader. Okay, so the purpose of today's talk, everyone, is to help you recognize the key techniques authors use to develop characters in short stories, and to understand how those techniques guide your interpretation as a reader. Once you can identify how a character is being constructed on the page, you'll find it easier to analyze stories, support your interpretations with evidence, which is what we do when we produce literary analysis, and also explain why a character feels complex or meaningful. So, let's get into some of these ideas today, everyone. Okay? Because unlike novels, short stories have a limited amount of space. Okay, authors can develop characters through long explanations or extended backstories. Every line has to do some work. Okay, because of this, character development in short stories is often indirect. Think Jimmy in Aliens, the first example that we're looking at. It's often compressed. It's not as we don't have as much space to deal with these abilities to develop characters. And they're often revealed through details rather than explanation. Okay, and that's important, everyone. Authors won't explain characters directly in most cases. It will be up to the reader to interpret or infer actively what characters do. Okay, so this idea, everyone, leads us to discuss key techniques. Okay, but of course, the purpose of discussing character techniques, everyone, is this is the foundation of the course. Understanding authors' techniques like dialogue, for example, and how that produces an effect on the reader. This encourages critical thinking. Okay, it allows us to understand broader themes inside of stories because the words present those themes in certain ways. And it also builds these transferable skills, the idea of inference, selecting evidence, even close reading skills, which means really looking at the text to be able to, looking at the text as the source of those ideas. All right. So now that we understand a little bit about what these techniques do within stories and how they produce interpretive effects on the reader, I want to look at some specific techniques that authors use. Now, remember, everyone, we can describe techniques in many, many different ways. The ones that we're going to talk about here, these foundational characterization techniques, they're the techniques that fall into larger buckets. Okay, so the first techniques that we look at are this idea of direct characterization, first impressions. So, direct characterization, sometimes authors tell us who a character is directly. You know, for example, they say something like, he was quiet and withdrawn. This is direct characterization. This is when the author uses adjectives, typically some sort of modifiers, to tell us directly what a character is like. This establishes first impressions, and it reinforces maybe what we already suspect. Direct characterizations and statements, they guide our expectations. So, for example, in the story of Aliens with Jimmy, in the very beginning, he's looked at as quiet and gentle as a direct characterization. And this guides the expectations of the reader, okay? But they're not used much. And they're rarely used to tell the whole truth about a character. Strong stories, in fact, often complicate the direct characterizations that authors provide. Next, everyone. Authors can reveal characters through the actions of the story and the choices that they make. Okay, think about it this way, everybody. When someone says they will do something and then does the opposite, what are you more likely to trust as a source of revealing their character? You know, the old saying that don't do as I say, do as I do, for example. This applies to stories. And that means that one of the most powerful techniques is action, what a character does, especially under pressure. So, conflict, the crucible, this reveals values, fears, priorities, vulnerabilities, moral limits. Because when a character does something, we're more likely to trust that as a reader. So, for example, you know, do they step forward? Do they hang back? Do they speak up? Do they not say anything? Do they protect themselves or someone else? This reveals their priorities, values, moral limits once again. Okay? Actions matter more than intentions. And readers trust these actions because they feel authentic. We judge characters based on behavior, on their promises. Excellent. Next, we fall into a different, larger bucket, the idea that characters have things that they say and things that they think. So, characters are often revealed through dialogue, one of the oldest techniques, of course, in literary endeavors, because we can watch theater, we can listen to movies and watch movies, and what characters say, it is a function of who they are. Characters are revealed through dialogue, what they say and how they say it. So, for example, the tone of a character, are they hesitant, confident, sarcastic? Their word choice, is it formal, casual, or is it guarded? Or maybe what they avoid saying entirely, and this is an element of it as well. Okay, so dialogue teaches a lot about how characters act in social situations and sometimes what they truly think about things. It can show ideas around power dynamics, emotional distance, insecurity, or desires without naming them directly. And this is what dialogue can do. Okay, because dialogue creates intimacy. Now, the most intimate we can get with a character, though, is to read their inner thoughts. Okay, for example, in the story of Aliens, there is no inner access to Jimmy's thoughts. And this means that we don't get direct access to how he feels. We're only told a story that tells us about Jimmy. So this has an impact on the character that we understand. Okay? Because when we're given access to a character's thoughts, we see private fears, guilt, longing, uncertainty, the things that they might not expressly say in a dialogue, for example. Okay? So access to thoughts can be limited or selective. Okay, and this is something we have to understand as well, but it is a way of gaining intimacy with a character. And sometimes we'll see inner thoughts of one character, but not another. And the idea here is that inner thoughts, it creates a certain sympathy for a character and maybe mystery around others. This is true in the story Aliens, because one of the key themes in this story is the idea of mystery. The aliens in the sky provide a certain element of mystery, and so does the character of Jimmy. And mystery in the same way, it's more a mystery that results from unfamiliarity. We're a little bit curious about who they are, the aliens and Jimmy. So people start to fill in the blanks with their own theories around who these people are. Okay? This gap, it invites interpretation. Good. And finally, everybody, and something we're going to study later in class, setting in the semester, one of my favorite aspects of technique. We talk about physical appearance, detail, things like that. So, physical description of something is rarely just about appearance, everybody. Authors choose details. Remember, choice is important when we talk about techniques, of course, because authors choose all of these elements of a story. And when an author chooses a certain aspect of appearance, for example, clothing, the posture of the person, gestures, grooming, you ask yourself, you don't take it at face value. You ask yourself, perhaps, why this detail? Okay. What does it suggest about how the characters see themselves or want to be seen? This is true in the story Aliens. because a physical appearance of a character or the setting that is chosen as a detail, for example, think of the Christmas lights in Jimmy's apartment or the pictures of leaders that were on the walls, a very reverent idea that you have leaders' pictures on the wall that you have a lot of respect for. There's a detail here that we ask more questions about. Why this detail? What does it say about the character? It's more than just the appearance of something. So appearance can help us infer things like social position, the confidence, vulnerability, resistance to norms, are they a rebel? Without the author actually stating this thing outright. All right. And of course, interactions with other characters play an important role. How a character treats other people reveals how more than how they describe themselves. And for example, in the story of Aliens, the way Jimmy treats Chandra is with great respect and care. And this is in contrast to some of the things that maybe we assume at the beginning of the story. So we look at how they act towards authority. We act how characters treat someone with less power than they have, or how they behave differently depending on certain situations. And these interactions help us evaluate characters ethically. Remember, it's all about the interpretation of the reader. What do we think about these characters? And that can be in a certain ambiguous state too. This is one thing that we will learn about much later in the class as we go forward. The idea of ambiguity, not exactly knowing the truth as a reader. And that's okay. All right? Because finally, everybody, the impact of setting is something that exists in stories and is very, very important to the identity of characters. It mirrors their emotions often and the way that they feel. All right. Because characters don't exist in a vacuum. They need to have a certain setting inside of stories. And this can reflect, once again, emotional states. It mirrors the way that they feel about things. We'll get to that when we discuss the story of the third and final continent. Setting can be a strong indicator of identity. When you think about it, the things that we surround ourselves with and the clothing that we choose to wear, these elements of setting, this has a great impact on how we feel about ourselves, our identity. Okay? And also our sense of belonging and isolation in certain situations. For example, setting can relate to things of culture, food, and the clothing that we wear, the ceremonies that we visit, the ways that we decorate our private spaces, whatever it is. This relates to our identity, our belonging, and our senses of isolation. So setting can reveal elements of character because it shows where they choose to live, whether or not they feel at home or out of place, and how they even move through public spaces. So setting often mirrors internal conflict. It deepens our understanding of a character's relationship to the world. And finally, everyone, the idea of change in stories is a great technique. Um, considering how characters change, or they don't, perhaps, by the end of the story. And in short stories, change can be subtle, can be an internal change, or revealed in a single decision, perhaps. We're going to look at this when we see the story The Watcher by Guy Vanderhaeg. There's a great scene towards the end where the character makes a decision, and this changes everything and reveals how we understand this character. So the idea here is that we reassess earlier assumptions. Once looked insignificant may turn out to be deeply meaningful, and this is the idea of change, character arc. Okay? In the story of Aliens, as a matter of fact, you find that Jimmy is an astoundingly consistent character, not something that changes greatly throughout the story. The only thing that changes is the way that we feel about that character. So, to sum up, everyone, authors develop characters in short stories by telling us some things directly, but showing us far more things through actions, dialogue, interactions with other characters, and the setting. And this often is much more impactful to understanding the character. As a reader, it's your job to follow the plot, for sure, but notice how character information is delivered. So, for example, when you ask, why did the author show us this instead of saying it, showing us something as opposed to dialogue, you're moving from reading passively to reading critically, asking questions about the text. And this